My name's Caitlin Hagen, and I'm one of the veterinary officers at Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development in Western Australia. As you're probably aware, Johne's disease cattle strain, C strain, was confirmed in cattle in southern WA in September 2021. The department met with WA cattle industry representatives and determined that it was not technically feasible or economical to eradicate JD C strain. Following this decision, the department remains committed to supporting WA through this transition by providing further information on JD and supplying resources such as this webinar to assist producers and the industry to better understand JD and biosecurity planning. Before we explore the biosecurity considerations for JD, an overview of the disease is needed to better understand how best to control or manage your risk. JD is a chronic, incurable infectious disease that affects ruminants. This includes cattle, buffalo, sheep, goats, alpaca, and deer. It's caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium avian subspecies paratuberculosis and results in progressive diarrhea, weight loss, and reduced production, and eventually death. It's a nationally notifiable disease, and anyone with a suspicion or detection of JD in livestock must report it to a biosecurity and agricultural management authorised inspector, such as a DPIRD field veterinary officer, as soon as possible. JD is defined nationally and internationally as infection with any strain of Mycobacterium avian subspecies tuberculosis. This includes sheep, cattle, and bison strains. All strains can affect more than one species, not just the strain that they are named for. For example, cattle can be infected with sheep strain. Note that the detection of JD in any species on a property can mean that the property is ineligible to supply livestock for some live export markets and may also impact on the herd's Johne's beef or dairy assurance score status. The tricky part about JD is that typically livestock become infected when they're very young, usually less than 12 months of age. However, JD has a very long incubation period. This means that although cattle are infected when they're very young, it takes about 3 to 5 years before they start to shed the disease. Until this happens, it cannot be detected, and it's sometimes even longer before cattle will show signs of being unwell. It's only very late in the disease that cattle will show signs such as weight loss, weakness, and diarrhea. However, long before this point, cattle will have been shedding the bacteria and infecting the rest of the herd. So, how are livestock actually infected with JD? Well, it's spread between animals through feces of infected animals or infected colostrum or milk. Soil, feed, or water can also be contaminated by the bacteria, and it can survive for up to 12 months in the environment and soil. As already mentioned, young animals under 12 months of age are the most susceptible to becoming infected, and this typically occurs through suckling udders contaminated with infected feces or by grazing contaminated pasture or feed. Also remember that any susceptible livestock can be infected through contact with fecal contamination from another susceptible species, whether that be cattle, sheep, goats, alpaca, deer, or buffalo, or by grazing land previously grazed by other infected livestock. Now, what tests can be done to look for and diagnose livestock infected with JD? Several tests are available, but it's important to know that they each have their own limitations. Fecal tests, either the HTJ, PCR, or culture, are the most accurate or sensitive test. However, they can only pick up the infection when animals are old enough to shed it in their feces. As already mentioned, livestock are typically infected when they're very young, but don't shed the disease until after 3 to 5 years of age. Infected animals can also intermittently shed, meaning they may or may not test negative even if they're infected. This means that even if you test your cattle and they're negative, it's still possible that they're just not shedding the bacteria yet, so it can't be detected. Testing large numbers of homebred animals over 4 years of age, plus any introduced animals over 4 years of age provides the best chance of detecting the disease if it's present. The larger the number of animals tested with negative results, the more confidence you can have in those results because they indicate a low likelihood of infection on that property and in animals originating from that herd. Other tests, such as an ELISA blood test, are available but are not generally recommended as they're not as sensitive and false positive results are really common. Producers should consult their private vet to determine the most appropriate testing regime for their property. A vet can also advise on the suitability of testing undertaken on properties where livestock may be sourced. Keeping in mind the limitations of fecal testing, how sure can you be if you test your herd or you're buying from a herd that's undertaken testing that JD is not present? Well, let's assume that when you do your testing, that if it were present, only 1% of the herd was infected, so a very small number of cattle. How confident could you be, if that were the case, the testing would have picked it up? Well, as we already said, the larger the number of animals tested with negative results, the more confidence you can have in the results. If cattle are shedding intermittently, the more cattle you test, more often, the more likely you are to detect JD. So let's say that property 1 has 50 homebred cattle that are 4 years of age. If the property does just one check test, testing 50 head, their confidence would be 39%, which is very low. Repeating testing will always increase your confidence. If they did 2 check tests, 2 tests of 50 head, they'd get to 63%. Now, just notice that for smaller properties, a check test, a test of 50 head, may end up being the same as a sample test, which should be a larger herd level test, but if the herd is small, then whatever eligible cattle are present are tested. Whilst this property cannot get a high confidence that they're free from JD, if they choose to repeat testing again, their confidence would increase. Compare this to property 3, which has 200 homebred cattle over 4 years of age. If they only do a check test, a smaller test, then their confidence is 29%, which is very low. However, remember, the bigger the test, the higher the confidence. If this property does a sample test and a check test, they get to 90%, or 2 sample tests get to 98% confidence, which is very, very high. Remember, how confident you can be that a property is free of JD is dependent on testing. And if you want a high confidence, aim to have more cattle that are 4 years of age and older more often. As we've seen, it may be several years between the time of infection and livestock being capable of spreading JD or showing signs of the disease. Because of this, there are 3 key factors producers should consider when undertaking JD biosecurity planning, and these are: 1. The impact of JD at an individual property level. 2. The likelihood that JD will be introduced onto the property. And finally, 3. Property level risk mitigation strategies. Let's first have a look at what the impact of JD would be at an individual property level. The level of risk control measures necessary will always depend on the individual property's business model. When deciding, producers should consider the enterprise type. What would the production impact or consequence be if JD were introduced onto the property? Maybe very minimal for some, but very significant for others. How would property management reduce or worsen the impact of the disease? What level of control is actually needed? Another consideration is how would JD impact market access? For producers who send animals for live export, what are the export market access requirements for JD? Remembering the detection of JD in any species on a property can affect eligibility for certain markets. And finally, what are the potential requirements of domestic clients? These may vary dramatically for studs compared to, say, properties that supply livestock direct to abattoir. Let's look at the impact of JD on trade and market access a little bit further for a moment. For live animal export markets, the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, DOR, and DPIRD are required to verify that both the individual animals being exported and their supplying property of origin meet the importing country's requirements. Certification for JD is and always has been at a property level. DPIRD's Property of Origin Statement verification underpins the DOR International Certification and verifies that the WA supplying property meets the requirements. Requirements for JD vary between different countries, and producers should contact DOR or view the Manual of Importing Country Requirements, or MICOR, for specific market requirements. These can change over time, so it's recommended to confirm requirements with DOR in advance of preparing livestock. The detection of JD of any strain type in any species on a property would make that property ineligible for some live export markets for the timeframe defined in the importing country requirements. Detection of JD in either your cattle or your sheep may mean you're ineligible for a set time to supply either or even both species to markets with JD import requirements. We've excluded cattle from export before because of JD detections in sheep on the same property. Please contact DPIRD at Livestock Biosecurity at dpird.wa.gov.au if you have any queries whether your property meets any market-specific eligibility requirements. Coming back to biosecurity planning, once you've determined what impact JD would have on your property, the next part to consider is what's the likelihood that it could be introduced? The most common way JD enters a property is when seemingly healthy but infected stock are introduced. As we already discussed, livestock only show signs of the disease after 3 to 5 years of age or more, and testing cannot detect infected stock unless they're actively shedding the bacteria. Firstly, whilst there is a lot of concern within the WA industry about the recent detection of JD sea strain, the prevalence of JD in cattle in WA is extremely low, and your greatest risk of introducing JD at this time is still going to be from livestock that are from interstate or from sheep or properties that run cattle and sheep within WA, because sheep strain is endemic in WA. The risk that sheep pose in WA is significant, as JD is prevalent in WA sheep and the number of detections of sheep strain in cattle is actually increasing over time. If you're worried about livestock you may have already introduced and their status, would encourage you to go back to the person that you purchased them from and ask questions about their JD testing, vaccination, and trading practices. Most importantly, be aware of the status of livestock and of the property before you purchase. Producers must consider the livestock origin and the history of the source property. Tools to assist and questions to ask when making these decisions include always asking for a national cattle health declaration when buying livestock. This contains important information and includes a legal declaration about the JD status of the property. It shows the livestock's biosecurity status and health information, such as the testing and clinical history of the supplying property and the livestock's vaccination status. The National Cattle and Sheep Health Declarations include vaccination status of the individual animal. Vaccination can reduce the likelihood of those animals shedding disease if applied in accordance with manufacturer directions, even if the herd status of the source property is not known. Risk profiling tools such as Johne's Beef Assurance Score, JBAS, and Johne's Disease Dairy Score, JDDS, are another tool. These are self-declarations, and generally the higher the score the better, noting that scores above 6 for both schemes requires a degree of testing to be undertaken. Properties with a higher score are considered less likely to have JD. However, The scores are a guide only and should be used in conjunction with other biosecurity practices to minimise the risk of introducing JD onto your property. These schemes are voluntary industry schemes. They rely on self-declaration and don't have any government oversight. It's really important that producers understand how a score is assigned so that they can ask questions and verify that the cattle being purchased are actually the score that they're stated to be. About the property's biosecurity plans and use biosecurity checklists, such as the one developed by Animal Health Australia and linked on our website. Find out what testing history the property has and decide if it's sufficient to provide the level of confidence that you require. Remember that repeated herd level fecal testing of large numbers of cattle 4 years of age and older gives you the greatest confidence. Vaccination status and history of movement of susceptible livestock species on that property. Remembering that JD can be transmitted between different susceptible species. In summary, sourcing animals from properties with a negative testing history for JD and which run closed herds or have no or minimal low risk introductions can help to reduce JD risk. Properties which have sourced susceptible livestock from properties with no testing history or from an area in Australia with a high prevalence of JD are at a higher likelihood of having the disease. The final step for biosecurity planning is considering property level risk mitigation strategies. Producers should consider for their property using tools such as JBAS and Dairy Assurance Score to validate their status. Developing and maintaining a biosecurity plan, ideally a veterinary approved plan, as well as biosecurity checklists, which will help you identify and manage risks to your business from JD. The plan should include decisions on, but not limited to, herd introductions of all JD susceptible species, co-grazing with JD susceptible species, testing and vaccination. Using national health declarations when selling your livestock. Consider other factors such as grazing management, including not co-grazing with other susceptible species and not grazing on land previously grazed by unknown status or infected livestock. Herd level fecal testing. Again, testing for JD is an important strategy that producers should also consider on their own property. Because livestock may be shedding the disease intermittently, meaning they could test negative but still be infecting other animals on the property, regular and repeated herd level fecal testing is important to detect the disease early before it spreads within the property. The use of vaccination, which I'll go into further in just a moment, and calf rearing programs as relevant to the property or enterprise. Now, I've mentioned JBAS and Johne's disease dairy score a few times already, so let's look at these a little bit further. Since national deregulation in 2016 and the removal of JD zones under cattle map, also in 2016, WA has not been recognised as a free zone. And remember that JD sheep strain is endemic in WA. Therefore, a JD status can only be determined at a property level. Consequently, voluntary risk profiling industry assurance schemes, JBAS and Johne's disease dairy score, were implemented nationally to assist cattle producers in verifying their property's JD status. These schemes rely on self-declarations by producers. There is no government oversight of these schemes and the department is not responsible for them. These schemes are one tool of a suite of biosecurity tools for producers to use in managing their JD risk. When JBAS first began, WA beef producers with no history of JD in sheep on their property could obtain an interim JBAS score of 8, but this was conditional upon completing a vet-approved biosecurity plan by July of 2017 and undertaking a check test by July of 2018. If producers didn't do both in the required timeframes and had no history of JD in sheep, at their time, their JBAS score would have reduced to 6. Further information on JBAS is located on the Animal Health Australia website. Vaccination is another strategy that I've mentioned. Cilirum is an inactivated, killed vaccine that may not prevent infection with JD, but can significantly reduce its spread by reducing shedding of the bacteria in infected cattle. It's not currently approved for use by veterinarians in cattle in WA. DPIRD will notify cattle industry stakeholders when the legislative requirements for the supply of the vaccine are finalised. However, in the interim, applications may be submitted by vets to DPIRD for approval of use of an unregistered veterinary product. Gadir is a similar vaccine already approved for use in sheep and goats. Vaccination is most effective when given to calves between 3 and 6 weeks of age. However, vaccination of cattle older than this may still reduce shedding. Users might consider vaccinating cattle, particularly when introducing cattle or in herds where JD has been confirmed. Vaccination should be used to complement on-farm disease management practices and as part of a general farm biosecurity plan to minimise the likelihood and impact of JD. Cattle studs, including those not known to be infected with JD, may consider vaccinating their sale calves to give buyers increased assurance that the cattle will not spread JD later in life if the property is subsequently found to be infected. However, it's really important to be aware that vaccinated cattle may be ineligible for export to importing countries with JD or tuberculosis requirements. The vaccine can cause false positive results for both JD when undertaking blood testing and tuberculosis. It's also a legal requirement that all animals vaccinated with Silaram must be identified as Silaram vaccinated by applying a 3-hole punch, preferably in the outer third of the ear. The person giving the vaccine must ensure vaccinated animals are recorded in the National Livestock Identification System NLIS database as JD vaccinated. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with the department, and thanks very much for listening.